The rain hammered against the depot's tin roof like bullets, each drop echoing the emptiness that had carved itself into Lily's chest. She pressed her back against the cold brick wall, watching the last passengers disappear into the storm with their families, their laughter swallowed by thunder. At 17, she had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford until the scuffed boots appeared in her vision. The cowboy didn't speak at first. He simply lowered himself onto the bench beside her, his weathered hands unwrapping a cloth bundle that smelled of fresh bread and roasted meat. The aroma made her stomach clench with hunger she'd been ignoring for 2 days. She'd spent her last coins on the train ticket to nowhere, chasing a job advertisement that turned out to be a cruel hoax. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice carrying the gentle roughness of someone who'd spent years talking to horses more than people. His hat dripped steadily, creating a small puddle at his feet. "Name's Jake Sullivan." Lily studied him from the corner of her eye. He was older than her, maybe 25, with calloused hands and eyes the color of coffee beans. His clothes were simple but clean, and there was something about the way he sat, patient, unhurried, that made her shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. "I'm Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Jake nodded and tore his sandwich in half, offering her the larger piece without ceremony. Hungry, pride warred with desperation in her chest. She'd been raised in the St. Mary's orphanage to never take charity, to stand on her own 2 feet. But the kindness in his gesture, the way he didn't make her beg or explain herself, cracked something open inside her. "I can't pay you back," she said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "Wasn't asking you to." Jake's smile was soft, transforming his weathered face. Sometimes sharing a meal is payment enough. As she bit into the sandwich, tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. The bread was still warm, the meat tender and seasoned with herbs that reminded her of the garden Sister Margaret used to tend. For a moment, she wasn't the girl who'd aged out of the orphanage with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and broken dreams. She was just someone worth feeding. "Where you headed?" Jake asked, his own eating slow and deliberate. "Don't know," Lily admitted. "Anywhere that's not here." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain create rivers in the dusty street. "I've got a ranch about 50 miles north. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof that doesn't leak, and a kitchen that always smells like coffee. Could use someone who knows how to work hard." The offer hung between them like a lifeline. Lily had learned to be suspicious of kindness from strangers. But something in Jake's manner, the way he'd shared his food without questions, the steady patience in his voice, made her want to trust again. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Jake turned to meet her eyes, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not charity, but recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be alone in the world. "Because," he said simply, "everyone deserves a chance to start over." The storm began to ease, and with it, the first stirrings of something Lily had thought was dead forever. Hope. The wagon ride to Jake's ranch stretched through rolling hills, painted gold by the late afternoon sun. Lily sat beside him on the wooden seat, acutely aware of how his strong hands guided the reins with practiced ease. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of sage and wildflowers. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. "There she is," Jake said, pointing ahead to where a modest log house nestled in a valley beside a creek lined with weeping willows. Home. The ranch wasn't grand, just a simple 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a red barn, and several outbuildings scattered across the property. But it was more beautiful than any mansion to Lily's eyes. Smoke curled from the chimney, and horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. It looked like the kind of place where a person could belong. "It's perfect," she breathed, not caring if he heard the wonder in her voice. Jake's expression softened. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the main house with his own hands." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "Lost my parents to fever when I was 20. Been running it alone since then." Lily understood the weight of that loneliness. She'd felt it every day since leaving the orphanage. The crushing realization that she had no family, no place where she was expected or missed. But here, beside this man who'd shared his meal with a stranger, she felt something shift inside her chest. As they approached the house, an elderly woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her silver hair was pulled back, in a neat bun, and her eyes held the same kindness Lily had seen in Jake's. "This is Mrs. Henderson," Jake said, helping Lily down from the wagon. "She's been cooking for the ranch hands since before I was born. Mrs. H, this is Lily. She'll be staying with us for a while." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face broke into a warm smile. Well, bless your heart, child. You look like you could use a good meal and a soft bed. She studied Lily with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades caring for others. Come along, dear. Let's get you settled. The inside of the house was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and quilts that spoke of generations of love. Mrs. Henderson led Lily to a small room on the second floor, complete with a brass bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a window that looked out over the Willow Creek. This was Jake's mother's sewing room, Mrs. Henderson explained, smoothing the quilt with gentle hands. She would have liked you, I think. She always said this house needed more laughter. That evening, Lily sat at the long kitchen table with Jake and the 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. The conversation flowed around her talk of cattle prices and weather, repairs needed on the north fence, and plans for the upcoming harvest. Nobody asked her intrusive questions or made her feel like an outsider. She was simply included, as if she'd always belonged there. After dinner, Jake walked her to the porch. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and the sound of the creek created a gentle melody in the darkness. I want to earn my keep, Lily said, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. I won't be a burden. Jake leaned against the porch railing, his profile strong in the moonlight. You're not a burden, Lily. But if you want to work, there's plenty to do. Mrs. Henderson could use help with the cooking and cleaning. We've got a vegetable garden that needs tending, and the chickens are always getting into mischief. I know about chickens, Lily said, remembering the small flock Sister Margaret had kept at the orphanage. And I can cook. Not fancy, but edible. That's more than most of us can manage, Jake said with a chuckle. Mrs. Henderson's been threatening to make us learn to fend for ourselves if we don't start appreciating her efforts. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Lily had never felt such peace. For the first time in her life, she wasn't counting the days until she'd have to leave. Thank you, she said softly. For the meal, for bringing me here, for everything. Jake turned to face her, his eyes serious. We all need a place to belong. Lily, looks like you found yours. As she lay in the soft bed that night, surrounded by the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of her new home, Lily dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was finally beginning. 3 weeks at the ranch transformed Lily in ways she hadn't expected. Her hands, once soft from orphanage domestic work, grew strong from kneading bread and tending the vegetable garden. The hollow look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that resembled contentment. She woke each morning to the sound of Jake's voice drifting up from the kitchen as he discussed the day's work with the hands. And she fell asleep to the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the willows. Mrs. Henderson had become both teacher and confidant, showing Lily how to make Jake's favorite biscuits and sharing stories about the ranch's history. That boy's been carrying the weight of this place on his shoulders too long, she said one afternoon as they hung laundry on the line. Needs someone to share the load. Lily felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't think he sees me that way, Mrs. H. The older woman's eyes twinkled with mischief. Child, I've been watching that man for 5 years. I know the difference between how he looks at the cattle and how he looks at you. The truth was, Lily had begun to notice the way Jake's gaze lingered on her during meals, how he always seemed to find excuses to work near whatever task she was doing. When she'd struggled to repair a loose board on the chicken coop, he'd appeared at her side with tools and patient instruction. When she'd mentioned missing the books from the orphanage library, he'd surprised her with a collection of novels from town. You read? She'd asked, running her fingers over the worn spines. My mother insisted, he'd said, his voice soft with memory. She said a man who couldn't read was only half educated, no matter how well he knew ranching. They'd begun spending evenings on the porch, taking turns reading aloud, while the other mended clothes, or were told. Jake's voice was rich and warm when he read, bringing characters to life with surprising skill. Lily found herself looking forward to these quiet hours more than anything else in her day. One evening, as they sat reading beneath the stars, Jake closed the book and turned to face her. Can I ask you something? Lily's heart skipped. Of course. What happened to your family? How did you end up at the orphanage? The question she'd been dreading hung in the air between them. Lily had crafted dozens of stories over the years, tragic tales of parents lost to disease or accident. Anything more romantic than the truth. But sitting there in the gentle darkness, surrounded by the security Jake had given her, she found herself telling him the real story. I was left on the orphanage steps when I was 3 days old, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No note, no explanation. Just a baby in a basket with a blanket, that had Lily embroidered in the corner. Jake's face softened with understanding, rather than pity. That must have been hard, growing up without knowing. I used to make up stories, Lily admitted. Imagine that my parents were traveling performers who had to give me up to keep me safe, or that they were nobility who would come back for me when I turned 18. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Childish dreams. Not childish, Jake said firmly. Everyone needs hope to survive. What about you? Lily asked, grateful to turn the conversation away from her own pain. What was it like growing up here? Jake's expression grew distant. Paradise. Until it wasn't. My parents were the kind of people who made everything seem possible. This place was full of laughter and music. My mother played piano, and my father sang while he worked. When the fever took them both in the same week, he shook his head, felt like the music died with them. But you stayed, Lily observed. Where else would I go? This land is in my blood. But I'll admit, it's been lonely. A ranch is meant to be shared, meant to be filled with family. He looked at her then, his eyes holding a question he wasn't quite ready to ask. Lily's breath caught. The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to tell him that she understood about loneliness, and that maybe, together, they could fill the silence with something beautiful. Instead, she said, the music doesn't have to stay dead. You know, sometimes it just needs someone new to sing it. Jake's smile was slow and warm, like sunrise over the mountains. Maybe you're right, Lily. Maybe it's time to start making music again. As they sat there under the vast canopy of stars, Lily felt something bloom in her chestnut. Just hope, but the dangerous, wonderful possibility of love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a dusty rider who barely stayed long enough to water his horse. Jake's face went pale as he read the official document, his jaw tightening with each line. Lily, who had been feeding the chickens, noticed his distress and hurried to his side. What is it? She asked, her heart already sinking at the grim set of his features. Bank notice, Jake said, his voice hollow. They're calling in the loan on the ranch. I have 30 days to pay $1,500, or they'll foreclose. The amount might as well have been $15,000. Lily had learned enough about ranch finances to know that most of their money was tied up in cattle and land improvements. The recent drought had made feed expensive, and several head of cattle had been lost to disease. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face etched with worry. I heard shouting. What's happening? Jake crumpled the letter in his fist. Seems my father borrowed against the ranch to buy that prize bull 3 years ago. The bank's been patient, but they want their money now. There has to be something we can do, Lily said, her mind racing through possibilities. We could sell some of the cattle, maybe take out a smaller loan. Cattle prices are down, Jake interrupted, his voice bitter. And who's going to lend money to a rancher who's already in debt? He looked out over the land that had been his family's legacy, his shoulders sagging with defeat. Maybe it's time to accept that I'm not meant to keep this place going. The hopelessness in his voice broke something inside Lily. This man had saved her, had given her a home and a purpose, and now he was ready to give up everything that mattered to him. She couldn't let that happen. No, she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. This is your home, Jake, your family's legacy. We're not giving up without a fight. Over the next few days, Lily threw herself into finding solutions with the determination of someone who finally had something worth fighting for. She rode into town with Mrs. Henderson, asking discreet questions about cattle prices and loan options. She wrote letters to agricultural suppliers, trying to negotiate better terms for feed and equipment. She even visited the bank, though the meeting left her feeling more discouraged than hopeful. The banker, a thin man with cold eyes and a calculating smile, had made it clear that he saw an opportunity in the ranch's troubles. Prime land like that shouldn't be wasted on a failing cattle operation, he'd said. I have investors interested in developing the valley. That evening, Lily found Jake by the creek, skipping stones across the water with mechanical precision. His usual warmth had been replaced by a resigned sadness that made her chest ache. I've been thinking, he said without looking at her. Maybe you should start making plans to leave. I can give you enough money to get to San Francisco, maybe find work there. I'm not leaving, Lily said, settling beside him on the bank. Lily, be practical. When the bank takes this place, I'll have nothing to offer you. You deserve better than what? She interrupted, her voice rising. Better than a man who shared his meal with a stranger. Better than a home where I'm valued and cared for. Better than the first place I've ever belonged. Jake finally looked at her, his eyes dark with pain. You deserve security, Lily. A future, not a broke cowboy with nothing but debt and broken dreams. And you deserve someone who won't abandon you when things get difficult. She shot back. Someone who believes in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. They had been dancing around their growing feelings for weeks. But the crisis had stripped away pretense and forced honesty. I'm in love with you, Lily said, her heart hammering against her ribs. I know I have no right to be, no right to expect anything from you, but I can't pretend anymore. This ranch, this life we've built together, it's worth fighting for. Jake's expression crumbled. Lily, ... I know you have feelings for me too, she continued, her voice trembling but determined. I see it in the way you look at me, the way you go out of your way to make me smile. We could build something beautiful here, Jake, but only if you're willing to fight for it. He reached for her then, his calloused hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. I've been in love with you since the night you fell asleep, reading on the porch, he admitted. But love doesn't pay debts, Lily. It doesn't save ranches. Maybe not, she said, leaning into his touch. But it gives us a reason to try. Jake's kiss was soft and desperate, tasting of hope and heartbreak. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, and she could feel the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. All right, he whispered, we fight. The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming was risky, perhaps foolhardy, but it was their only chance. Jake would enter the regional rodeo circuit, competing in bronc riding and bull riding events where the prize money could be substantial. It meant leaving the ranch for weeks at a time, trusting Lily and Mrs. Henderson to keep things running, but the potential payout could save their home. You haven't competed in years, Mrs. Henderson worried, wringing her hands as Jake packed his gear. Those young men are half your age and twice as reckless. I still practice, Jake said, though Lily could see the uncertainty in his eyes. And I've got more reason to win now than I ever did before. The night before he left, Jake and Lily walked down to the creek, where they'd shared so many quiet evenings. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water, and making the willow branches dance in the gentle breeze. I want you to know, Jake said, taking her hands in his, that no matter what happens, these past few weeks have been the best of my life. You've brought music back to this place. Lily, you've brought it back to me. You're going to win, she said with more confidence than she felt. And when you come back, we're going to save this ranch and build the life we both deserve. Jake pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and Lily's breath caught. I know the timing isn't ideal, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know I should wait until we're not facing ruin, until I can offer you security and a proper future. But I can't leave without telling you how I feel, without making you a promise. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond that caught the moonlight like a captured star. This was my mother's ring. She would have loved you, Lily. She would have seen what I see, a woman with the strength to fight for what she believes in, the courage to love even when it's scary. Tears spilled down Lily's cheeks. Jake, ... I'm not asking you to marry me now, he said quickly. I'm asking you to wait for me, to believe in us. When I come back with the money to save this place, I want you to be my wife. I want to fill this ranch with our children, our laughter, our love. Yes, Lily whispered, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, I'll wait. I'll believe. I'll love you whether you come back with money or empty-handed. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They sealed their engagement with a kiss that tasted of promises and desperate hope. The next morning, Lily stood on the porch, watching Jake's wagon disappear over the hill, her heart torn between pride and terror. Mrs. Henderson put an arm around her shoulders. He'll come back, the older woman said softly. That boy's got too much to live for now. The days that followed were a blur of hard work and worry. Lily threw herself into ranch duties with fierce determination, rising before dawn to milk the cows and feed the chickens, spending long hours in the garden and kitchen. She wrote letters to Jake every evening, pouring out her heart and sharing the small details of daily life that she hoped would remind him of what waited for him at home. His letters in return were sporadic, arriving with traveling merchants or fellow ranchers who'd seen him compete. The news was mixed. He'd won some events and lost others, gradually building a reputation on the circuit, but not accumulating money fast enough to ease Lily's growing anxiety. 3 weeks into his absence, disaster struck. A summer storm brought hail that damaged the vegetable garden and spooked the cattle. 2 calves were injured, and the north fence was destroyed by a fallen tree. The repairs would cost money they didn't have, and Lily found herself making increasingly desperate choices about which bills to pay. "We might have to sell some of the breeding stock," she told Mrs. Henderson over a meager dinner of beans and cornbread. "Those cattle are the future of this ranch." Mrs. Henderson protested. "Without them, even if Jake wins enough to pay off the bank, we'll have nothing to rebuild with." Lily twisted her engagement ring around her finger, the small diamond catching the lamplight. She had an idea, a terrible, necessary idea that made her stomach clench with dread. "There might be another way," she said slowly, "but you're not going to like it." The next morning, Lily rode into town with her heart hammering and her mother's ring in her pocket. The pawnshop owner, a gruff man with kind eyes, examined the ring with professional interest. "It's a good piece," he said finally. "I can give you $80 for it." $80 would buy feed for the cattle and materials to repair the fence. It would keep the ranch running for another month, maybe two. But it would also mean selling the most precious thing she owned, the symbol of Jake's love and their future together. "I'll take it," she said, before she could lose her nerve. Walking back to the ranch with the money in her pocket and her finger feeling strangely empty, Lily tried to convince herself she'd made the right choice. The ring was just a symbol, after all. The love it represented was still real, still strong. Jake would understand. But as she looked out over the land they both loved, the land they were fighting so hard to save, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just sacrificed something irreplaceable for something that might not be savable at all. Jake returned on a dusty Thursday afternoon, his face weathered by sun and defeat. From the slump of his shoulders and the way he avoided her eyes, Lily knew before he spoke that their gamble had failed. He climbed down from the wagon with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion and countless nights sleeping on hard ground. "I got $800, he said, his voice hollow. "Not enough. Not nearly enough." Lily's heart broke at the defeat in his voice, but she pushed aside her own despair to comfort him. "You did everything you could," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "We still have a week before the bank deadline." "Maybe there's no maybe." Jake's eyes were red-rimmed and haunted. "I watched young men get trampled for prize money that wouldn't buy a decent horse. I slept in stables and ate scraps. And for what? I'm still $700 short." Mrs. Henderson appeared with a steaming bowl of stew and a cup of coffee, her face creased with worry. "You eat something first," she commanded with maternal authority. Decisions made on an empty stomach are usually poor ones. As Jake ate mechanically, Lily found herself studying his hands. They were scarred and swollen, testament to weeks of gripping reins and fighting 1,000-pound animals. He'd risked everything for her, for their future, and she loved him more desperately than ever. "Jake," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked up, and she saw him notice her bare ring finger. His face went pale. "The ring," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I sold it," Lily said, meeting his gaze steadily. "The cattle needed feed, and the fence needed repair. I used the money to keep the ranch running while you were gone." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pushed back from the table and walked out of the house, letting the screen door slam behind him. Lily found him by the creek, sitting on the bank with his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs that cut through her heart like a blade. "I'm sorry," she said, kneeling beside him. "I know what that ring meant to you, what it meant to us. But you don't understand," Jake said, his voice muffled by his hands. "That ring was the last thing I had of my mother. It was supposed to be passed down through generations, a symbol of lasting love in our family." "It still is," Lily said desperately. "The love is still here, Jake. The promise is still real." Jake lifted his head, and she saw tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. "I failed you, Lily. I failed this ranch, failed my parents' memory. I couldn't save any of it." "You didn't fail me," she said fiercely. "You loved me enough to risk everything. You fought for us, for this place, for our future. That's not failure, heroism." "Pretty words," Jake said bitterly. "But they won't pay the bank or put food on the table or give you the life you deserve." "The life I deserve is with you," Lily shot back. "Rich or poor, landowner or drifter, I want to be wherever you are. Don't you understand that yet?" Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the exact moment when hope began to flicker in his eyes again. "Even if we lose everything." "We won't lose everything," Lily said, taking his scarred hands in hers. "We'll lose the ranch, maybe, but we'll have each other. We'll have our love, our dreams, our determination to build something new. That's not nothing, Jake, that's everything." They sat by the creek as the sun set, holding each other and making plans for an uncertain future. They would go to California, maybe, or head north to Montana, where land was still cheap and opportunities existed for those willing to work hard. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A woman stepped down from an elegant carriage, her eyes scanning the ranch with obvious interest. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Are you Jake Sullivan?" she asked, approaching the porch, where Jake and Lily sat sharing their morning coffee. "I am," Jake said warily. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, and there was something familiar about her expression that made Lily's heart skip. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." "I'm afraid I don't understand, ma'am," Jake said, standing politely. "I understand your ranch is in financial difficulty," Eleanor said, her voice kind but businesslike. "I'm prepared to make you an offer that might solve your problems." Jake's face hardened. "If you're here to buy the land cheap before the bank forecloses, you're wasting your time." "On the contrary," Eleanor said, her smile widening. "I'm here to pay off your debt entirely, with no strings attached." The silence that followed was deafening. Lily felt as if the world had tilted on its axis, as if everything she thought she knew about their situation had suddenly changed. "Why?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's eyes found Lily's, and suddenly she understood. The familiar smile, the way the woman's features seemed to echo her own. The timing of her arrival, it was impossible, but because, Eleanor said gently, 20 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my life. I left my 3-day-old daughter on the steps of St. Mary's orphanage, believing I was too young and too poor to give her the life she deserved. I've spent every day since then regretting that choice and searching for the little girl I named Lily. The world seemed to stop spinning. Lily stared at Eleanor Whitmore, searching her face for signs of deception, for some indication that this was a cruel joke or a case of mistaken identity. But the woman's eyes, gray-green like her own, held nothing but love and desperate hope. "That's impossible," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be." "I am," Eleanor said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm your mother, Lily. I know it's hard to believe, but I've been searching for you for 20 years. Jake moved protectively closer to Lily, his hand finding hers. "How did you find us?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Eleanor's smile was watery but genuine. "I hired private investigators years ago. They traced you from the orphanage to various employers, but you always seemed to be one step ahead of them. When I heard about a young woman named Lily working on a ranch in this area, I had to come see for myself." "But the money," Lily said, her mind reeling. "You said you'd pay off the debt. Why would you do that?" "Because I'm wealthy now," Eleanor explained. "I married well, became a widow young, and inherited a considerable fortune. Because I've spent 2 decades accumulating money that means nothing to me without the daughter I lost. Because I want to give you everything I couldn't give you 20 years ago." Lily stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. The magnitude of what she was hearing was overwhelming. After a lifetime of wondering about her origins, of creating stories about parents who might someday return, the reality was almost too much to process. "You left me," she said, her voice breaking. "You left me with nothing, not even a note explaining why." Eleanor's face crumpled. "I was 17 years old, Lily, younger than you are now. I was unmarried, disgraced, thrown out by my family. I had no money, no prospects, no way to care for a baby. I thought, I thought you'd be better off without me. I spent my entire childhood wondering if you were dead or alive," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength. "I made up stories about you, dreamed about you coming back for me. Do you know what it's like to grow up believing you're not worth keeping?" "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I do, because I've spent 20 years believing I wasn't worth forgiving." The pain in her mother's voice gave Lily pause. She turned to study Eleanor's face, seeing for the first time the lines of grief and regret that marked her features. This wasn't the reunion she'd imagined as a child. There was too much hurt, too many years of separation, to bridge easily. "I don't know how to do this," Lily admitted, her anger giving way to confusion. "I don't know how to be your daughter. After all this time." Eleanor stepped closer, her movements careful and respectful. "We don't have to figure it all out today," she said. "We have time now, all the time in the world." Jake squeezed Lily's hand. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. Lily looked at him, this man who had shown her what love could be, who had given her a home and a future. Then she looked at Eleanor, the woman who had given her life but had been absent for all the years that followed. "I want to know everything," she said finally. "I want to know who my father was, why you made the choices you did, where you've been all these years. But first, ... She turned to Jake. "First, I want to save our ranch." Eleanor's smile was radiant. "Consider it done. I'll wire the money to the bank this afternoon." "No," Lily said firmly. "Not as a gift. As a loan. Jake and I will pay you back. With interest. Over time. This ranch means too much to us to simply be given it." Jake's eyes widened with surprise and pride. "Lily, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said, meeting his gaze. "This is our home. Our future. We'll accept help, but we won't accept charity. Not even from family." Eleanor's expression softened with understanding. "You're as proud and stubborn as I was at your age. Very well. We'll draw up proper loan documents, make it all legal and binding." Over the next few hours, as they worked out the details of the loan arrangement, Lily began to see glimpses of the woman Eleanor had become. She was sharp, businesslike. But there was an underlying kindness that reminded Lily of Mrs. Henderson. She spoke carefully about her past, revealing bits and pieces of a story that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I named you after my grandmother," Eleanor said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "She was the only one who showed me kindness when I was carrying you. She died before you were born, but I wanted you to have her name, her legacy of strength." "Tell me about my father," Lily said quietly. Eleanor's face grew distant. "He was a traveling musician, charming and handsome, and completely unsuitable for a preacher's daughter. He promised to marry me, then disappeared when I told him about the baby. I was naive enough to believe his promises, foolish enough to think love conquered all." "Do you regret it?" Lily asked. "Having me? I mean, never," Eleanor said fiercely. "You were the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. Giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but regretting you, never." Jake had been quietly listening, and now he spoke up. "What changed? What made you able to search for her?" Eleanor's smile was sad. "My husband died 5 years ago. He was a good man, kind and patient, but he could never understand my need to find you," he thought. Dwelling on the past was unhealthy. "After he died, I realized I'd wasted too many years trying to forget instead of trying to heal." As the evening deepened, Mrs. Henderson joined them on the porch, bringing coffee and her own brand of motherly wisdom. "Well," she said, settling into her favorite rocking chair, "I suppose this explains why you took to ranch life so naturally, child. It's in your blood." "What do you mean?" Lily asked. Eleanor laughed, a sound both bitter and amused. "I didn't mention, my late husband owned one of the largest cattle ranches in Colorado. I've been running it since his death. Turns out the preacher's daughter who disgraced her family had a natural talent for business and livestock. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Lily had found her way to the life she was meant for, even without knowing her heritage." "So what happens now?" Jake asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Eleanor looked at her daughter, her eyes full of hope and uncertainty. "That depends on what Lily wants. I have a large house in Denver, plenty of room, and I'd love nothing more than to have you come live with me. You could have the education you never got, the opportunities you deserve." Lily felt the familiar tug of old dreams, the fantasy of a life of comfort and ease. But then she looked at Jake, at the ranch that had become her home, and Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to her. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "But my life is here now. This ranch, this man, this family we've built, it's what I want." Relief flooded Jake's face, but Eleanor's expression fell slightly. "I understand," she said, though her voice carried disappointment. "I waited 20 years to find you. I suppose I can't expect you to abandon the life you've built for yourself." "I didn't say I wanted to abandon you," Lily said gently. "I said I wanted to stay here. But that doesn't mean we can't have a relationship. You could visit, maybe spend time here during the summers. I could come to Denver occasionally." Eleanor's face brightened. "I'd like that very much. And," Lily added, glancing at Jake, "maybe you could help us plan a wedding. I believe I have some catching up to do on having a family involved in my life." Jake's eyes widened. "Lily, are you sure?" "We haven't even talked about I'm sure," she said firmly. "I've been sure since the night you proposed. Ring or no ring, I want to be your wife." Eleanor clapped her hands together, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my dear girl. I've missed so much of your life. But I'm here for this. I'm here for whatever you'll let me share." As they sat together on the porch, 3 generations of women, and the man who had brought them together, Lily felt a sense of completeness she'd never known before. She had found her family, not just the mother who had given her life, but the chosen family who had given her love. 3 months later, the ranch bustled with activity as preparations for the wedding reached their peak. Eleanor had thrown herself into the planning with the enthusiasm of a woman making up for lost time, but she'd been careful to defer to Lily's wishes on every decision. The result was a celebration that perfectly blended elegance with the rustic charm of ranch life. White roses climbed the arch Jake had built beneath the old oak tree by the creek, their fragrance mingling with the sage and wildflowers that dotted the valley. Chairs borrowed from the church in town formed neat rows on the grass, while long tables covered in Eleanor's finest linens awaited the feast Mrs. Henderson had been preparing for weeks. In the small bedroom that had become her sanctuary, Lily stood before the mirror while Eleanor fastened the tiny pearl buttons on her wedding dress. The gown was simple but elegant, made of ivory silk that caught the afternoon light like captured moonbeams. It had been Eleanor's gift to her daughter, sewn by the finest seamstress in Denver. "You're beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your grandmother would have been so proud." Lily touched the pearl necklace at her throat, another family heirloom that Eleanor had insisted she wear. "I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you," Eleanor said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the dress. She had the same stubborn streak, the same fierce loyalty to the people she loved. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Henderson peeked in, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's time, dear ones. The minister's ready, and that young man of yours is pacing a hole in the ground." Lily's heart fluttered with nervous excitement. Through the window, she could see the guests gathering, ranch hands from neighboring spreads, friends from town, and even some of Jake's rodeo competitors who had traveled from far away to witness the ceremony. It was more people than she'd ever had celebrate with her, and the thought was both thrilling and overwhelming. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, offering her arm. Lily nodded, though her knees felt weak. "I've been ready for this my whole life." They walked together toward the oak tree, where Jake waited with the minister. He looked impossibly handsome in his best suit, his hair neatly combed, and his face shining with joy. When he saw her, his expression transformed into something so full of love and wonder that Lily forgot to be nervous. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love through good times and bad, to build a life together based on trust and mutual respect. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was soft and reverent, sealing a promise that had been building between them since that first night at the train depot. The celebration that followed was everything Lily had never known she wanted. There was music and dancing. With a fiddle player Eleanor had hired, mixing traditional wedding songs with the folk tunes the ranch hands preferred. The food was abundant: Mrs. Henderson's famous fried chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from their own garden, and a towering wedding cake that had been Eleanor's contribution. As the evening wore on, Lily found herself standing at the edge of the festivities, watching the people who had become her family. Eleanor was deep in conversation with the minister about establishing a small church in the valley. Mrs. Henderson was teaching some of the younger guests how to dance the Virginia reel. Jake was accepting congratulations from the other ranchers, his face glowing with happiness. Having second thoughts, a familiar voice asked behind her. Lily turned to find Tom Brady, one of Jake's oldest friends, approaching with 2 glasses of punch. He was a weathered man in his 50s who'd known Jake since boyhood. "Not at all," Lily said, accepting the glass gratefully. "Just trying to take it all in. Jake's a good man," Tom said, following her gaze to where her new husband stood. "Lost his way for a while after his parents died, but finding you brought him back to himself." "I think we found each other," Lily said softly. "That's the way the best marriages work," Tom agreed. "My Martha and I were like that. 40 years we had together before the consumption took her. Best 40 years of my life." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake appeared at Lily's side, sliding his arm around her waist. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and she loved the way her new name sounded on his lips. "Care to dance with your husband?" The music had shifted to a slow waltz, and couples were moving together on the grass that served as their dance floor. Jake led her into the circle of dancers, his hand warm and steady at her back. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, her skirt swirling around his legs, her head resting against his shoulder. "I love you," she whispered against his ear. "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." They danced until the stars came out, until the last guest had gone home. until only family remained. Eleanor had insisted on staying at the ranch for a few more days, wanting to help with the cleanup and spend more time with her daughter. Mrs. Henderson had already claimed the guest room, declaring herself too tired to walk to her own cabin. Finally, as the grandfather clock in the parlor chimed midnight, Jake took Lily's hand and led her up the stairs to their bedroom. The room had been transformed with candles and flower petals, Eleanor's romantic gesture for the newlyweds. "Are you happy?" Jake asked, pulling her close once they were alone. Lily thought about the question, about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a desperate orphan with no family, no home, no future. Now she was a wife, a daughter, a woman with roots and purpose and more love than she'd ever dreamed possible. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm complete. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." Jake's smile was soft and full of promise. "Well then, Mrs. Sullivan, let's start building our forever." The first year of marriage brought challenges that tested their love and commitment in ways neither had expected. A harsh winter killed several head of cattle, spring floods damaged the south pasture, and a series of equipment failures strained their finances despite Eleanor's loan. But through it all, Jake and Lily faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each crisis weathered. Lily threw herself into ranch life with the passion of someone who had finally found her calling. She learned to ride like a seasoned cowhand, could spot a sick calf from 50 yards away, and had developed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes that amazed even the most experienced hands. Eleanor visited regularly, bringing not just emotional support, but practical business advice that helped them streamline operations and increase profits. "You're a natural rancher," Eleanor observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching Jake work with a difficult horse. "I think you got that from me, though I didn't discover it until much later in life." "I wish I'd known sooner," Lily said, unconsciously resting her hand on her still flat stomach. "About you, about where I came from. It might have saved me some." Wondering, Eleanor's eyes were sharp as she caught the gesture. "Lily, dear, is there something you want to tell me?" Heat rose in Lily's cheeks. She and Jake had been keeping the secret for only a week, waiting to be absolutely certain before sharing their joy. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "About 2 months along." Eleanor's face lit up with pure delight. "Oh, my darling girl. Does Jake know?" "I told him yesterday. He's been walking around with a smile that won't quit ever since." "And how do you feel about it?" Eleanor asked, her voice gentle. "Are you happy?" Lily considered the question. A year ago, the thought of having a child would have terrified her. She'd had no model for motherhood, no understanding of what it meant to be part of a family. But now, surrounded by love and security, the idea of bringing new life into the world felt like the most natural thing imaginable. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't know how to be a mother. I didn't have one for most of my life." "You had Mrs. Henderson," Eleanor pointed out, "and the sisters at the orphanage. You've seen love in action, even if you didn't recognize it at the time." "And I'll have you," Lily said, reaching for her mother's hand. "Our baby will have a grandmother who loves them." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I promise you, this child will never doubt that they're wanted and loved. They'll have the family you never had." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's approach, his face glowing with excitement. "Lily, you need to see this," he called out. "The mare is about to foal." They hurried to the barn, where the pregnant horse was pacing restlessly in her stall. Jake had been watching her for days, knowing that birth was imminent. As they settled quietly in the adjacent stall to observe, nature took its course with remarkable efficiency. Within an hour, a long-legged colt was standing on shaky legs, nuzzling against its mother's side. The sight was both ordinary and miraculous, a reminder of the cycles of life that governed ranch existence. "It's a good omen," Jake said softly, his arm around Lily's waist. "New life brings new hope." "What will you name him?" Eleanor asked, watching the colt's first tentative steps. Jake looked at Lily, and she saw the question in his eyes. They'd discussed names for their future children, but hadn't thought about the horses. "Freedom," Lily said suddenly. "We'll call him Freedom." It was a perfect name for a colt born on a ranch that represented liberty from the constraints of the past. Freedom to build a future based on love and choice rather than circumstance and survival. Over the following months, as Lily's pregnancy progressed, the ranch continued to flourish. The loan payments to Eleanor were made on time. Their cattle herd grew stronger, and they were able to hire additional help for the busy seasons. Jake proved to be an attentive and protective husband, sometimes to Lily's amusement. I can still milk the cows, she protested one morning when he tried to take over her chores. Not in your condition, he said firmly. What if one of them kicks? What if you slip on the wet barn floor? Jake Sullivan, if you don't let me do some work, I'm going to go crazy with boredom, she threatened. Though she was smiling, Mrs. Henderson intervened with her usual wisdom. A pregnant woman needs activity, not coddling, she told Jake. Let her do what she can, and help her with what she can't. As autumn arrived, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Lily felt the first stirrings of labor. The birth was long and difficult. Attended by the town doctor, and assisted by both Eleanor and Mrs. Henderson, Jake paced the parlor below, wearing a path in the carpet as he waited for word. When the baby's cry finally echoed through the house, Jake took the stairs 3 at a time. He found Lily exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Eleanor's hand-sewn blankets. Meet your daughter, Lily whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Jake's hands trembled as he took the baby, his eyes wide with wonder. She was perfect, tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength, dark hair that reminded him of Lily's, and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with alert curiosity. She's beautiful, he breathed. She's perfect. What will you call her? Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son-in-law cradle her granddaughter. Jake looked at Lily, and she nodded. They'd chosen the name months ago, knowing it was right, regardless of whether they had a son or daughter. Hope, Jake said. Her name is Hope Sullivan. It was a name that encompassed everything they'd built together: hope for the future, hope for their family, hope for the generations that would follow, hope for a life filled with love, purpose, and the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. 25 years had passed since that rainy night at the train depot, when Jake first shared his meal with a desperate young woman. The ranch had grown from a struggling operation to one of the most successful in the valley, its success built on hard work, wise decisions, and the unshakable foundation of love that Jake and Lily had created together. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. Hope had been joined by 3 more children, twin boys named Matthew and Mark, and another daughter, Grace, who had inherited her grandmother Eleanor's sharp mind for business. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled every room. The music that Jake had thought lost forever restored in abundance. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the valley in familiar shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of the Sullivan family gathered on the expanded porch. Eleanor, now in her 70s but still vibrant, sat in her favorite rocking chair with Grace on her lap, reading from a book of fairy tales. The twins, now 21 and fresh from agricultural college, debated the merits of different cattle breeds with the passion of young men who'd found their calling. Hope, 25, and the image of her mother at the same age, sat beside her parents on the porch swing, her own baby daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. She'd married Tom Brady's son the previous spring, and they'd built a house just over the hill, keeping the family close while starting their own traditions. Tell us the story again, Grandma, Grace demanded, closing the fairy tale book with a decisive snap. Tell us about how Mama and Papa met. Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling with the joy of a woman who'd lived to see her greatest dreams fulfilled. Oh, that old story. Haven't you heard it enough times? Never enough, Hope said, adjusting her sleeping daughter. It's the best love story ever told. Jake reached for Lily's hand, his thumb tracing over the simple gold band that had replaced his mother's ring years ago. They'd found the original ring in a pawn shop in Denver during one of their visits to Eleanor, and it now rested in their safe, waiting to be passed down to the next generation. It was a dark and stormy night, Jake began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a story told many times. Your mother was sitting alone at the train depot, looking like she'd lost her last friend in the world, and Papa was just a lonely cowboy with too much food and not enough sense to mind his own business. Lily added, her eyes sparkling with the same love that had bloomed between them all those years ago. I had exactly the right amount of sense, Jake protested, playing his part in the familiar exchange. I knew quality when I saw it. You knew trouble when you saw it, Lily corrected, but her smile took any sting from the words. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s but still spry enough to manage the household, emerged from the kitchen with a tray of coffee and her famous molasses cookies. She'd become the family's unofficial historian, keeper of stories and traditions. Tell them about the wedding, she suggested, settling into her own chair. Tell them about how beautiful your mother looked in that dress, and about how Papa cried when he saw her walking down the aisle, Matthew added with a grin. I did not cry, Jake protested. though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "You most certainly did," Eleanor said with authority. "I have never seen a man weep so openly at his own wedding." "They were tears of joy," Jake said with dignity. "A man's allowed to cry when he's been blessed beyond measure." As the familiar story unfolded, Lily found herself studying the faces around her. Each person on this porch represented a piece of the life she'd built, a thread in the tapestry of love that had grown from that first act of kindness at the train depot. Grace fell asleep in Eleanor's arms, her small hand clutching the fairy tale book. The twins gradually quieted their debate, drawn into the story of their parents' courtship. Hope rocked her baby gently, her expression soft with the contentment of a woman who'd grown up knowing she was loved without condition. "What's the moral of the story?" Grace asked sleepily, fighting to keep her eyes open. "That love finds a way," Jake said softly. "That kindness creates miracles. That sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. And that family isn't just about blood," Lily added, looking around at the mix of biological and chosen family that surrounded them. "It's about the people who choose to love you, who choose to stay, who choose to build something beautiful together." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the family began to disperse. Eleanor carried Grace to her bedroom. The twins headed to the bunkhouse where they still preferred to sleep, and Hope gathered her baby for the short walk home. Finally, only Jake and Lily remained on the porch, sitting in comfortable silence, as they had so many evenings before. The ranch was quiet, except for the gentle sounds of cattle settling for the night, and the whisper of wind through the willow trees. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Lily considered the question seriously, as she always did. They'd faced hardships over the years, seasons of drought, market downturns, the inevitable challenges of raising children and running a business. They'd lost Mrs. Henderson's husband to a heart attack, weathered Eleanor's serious illness 2 years prior, and dealt with the normal struggles of any long marriage. But through it all, they'd had each other. They'd built something lasting and beautiful, something that would continue long after they were gone. "None," she said finally. "Not a single one. Every choice led me here, to you, to this family, to this life. I wouldn't change anything." Jake squeezed her hand. "Even the hard parts." "Especially the hard parts," Lily said firmly. "They taught us what we were made of. They showed us that love really can conquer anything if you're willing to fight for it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the valley that had become their kingdom. In the distance, they could hear Hope's laughter drifting from her house, the sound of the next generation building their own happiness. "I love you, Lily Sullivan," Jake said, his voice carrying the same wonder it had held on their wedding day. "I love you too, Jake Sullivan," she replied, "forever and always." As they rose to go inside, Lily took one last look at the ranch that had become her world, the house where she'd learned what it meant to be loved, the barn where she'd discovered her calling, the creek where she'd been proposed to, the oak tree where she'd been married. Every corner held memories of a life well lived, she thought, about the young woman who'd sat alone at the train depot 25 years ago, hungry and desperate, and convinced that she was meant to be alone. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this legacy. But sometimes, Lily reflected as Jake's arm encircled her waist, the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest nights. Sometimes the greatest love stories start with the simple act of sharing a meal with a stranger. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that stranger becomes your whole world. In the end, love had indeed found a way. What began as a moment of kindness between strangers had blossomed into a legacy that would endure for generations. The young orphan who had sat alone had found not just a home, but a purpose, a family, and a love that transformed not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. The cowboy who had shared his meal had gained not just a wife, but a partner who helped him build an empire of the heart. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and the courage to believe in second chances.